Well, welcome everybody. I hope you can all hear me, and welcome to today's webinar to discuss climate leadership in the corporate sector. For those who don't know me, I'm Vaughan Lindsey, the CEO of the recently merged Natural Capital Partners and ClimateCare, two world-leading climate solution providers who've combined forces recently and are proud to have collectively delivered over 100 million tonnes of carbon reductions for our clients. This webinar is part of the Climate Week for NYC, so I hope you're enjoying this event as well as many other events that have been going on. And the usual sort of housekeeping, I assume by now, as we've all been working remotely for so long, that you know the sort of housekeeping rules. This session will be going for an hour. We'll make sure it does close in an hour. You'll be on mute and we'll keep you on mute. If you want to ask questions, there's a box on your right of your screen, so please use that to ask any questions. And the session is being recorded, which I hope everybody is comfortable with. Today's discussion will focus on our recent research into the climate commitment and actions of the Fortune Global 500. And we are really delighted to be joined by three Fortune Global 500 leaders to both digest and discuss our recent findings. If I can do quick introductions to our panelists, I will start with Alex, who has led this research and is our Director of Product Marketing at Natural Capital Partners. Say hello, Alex.
Hi, Vaughan, and hi, everyone.
Thank you, Alex. We also have Elizabeth Willmott, who is the Carbon Program Director at Microsoft. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone.
And then we have David Eichberg, who's Head of Climate Strategy at HP. Hi, David.
Hi, Vaughan. Thanks for having us.
Very good. And finally, Zelda Bentham, who is the Group Head of Sustainability at Aviva. Hi, Zelda.
Hi, everybody.
Very good. At least we know the volume works, so that's good news. Yes, very good. Just by way of context, we know that to achieve our Paris-aligned target to limit global warming to below 2 degrees, we need to reduce carbon emissions by 45% by 2030. That is really the target we need to go after, and we know that that is equivalent of the emissions of the US, Europe, India, and China combined by 2030, and that is some task. However, when we look at the science, we also know that the latest UN Synthesis report shows that emissions by 2030 are likely to be 16% higher than they were by 2010. So the gap between what we know we need to do and what looks like the trajectory on is big. And to me, the corporate sector can, and I would say needs to, play a critical role in closing this gap, the gap between ambition and action, as well as, I think, raising ambition about what is possible. And the research that Alex is going to talk to, and hopefully our panelists will talk to, is about what corporates have been doing to try and close that gap. And the research that Alex has done will talk about some encouraging findings and I think some concerning findings. The encouragement, I don't want to steal Alex's thunder, is there is some good news. There's a threefold increase in the net zero targets of people in the Fortune 500. But concerning that 60% of the Fortune Global 500 still don't have meaningful climate milestones by 2030. So encouragement, but also some concerns. Before we get on to Alex talking about the research, we wanted to do a quick poll to really sort of test the mood and gauge where everybody's at in the room. So we're now going to go into the realms of exciting technology, and Alex is going to raise a question, which is, which of these climate targets does your company plan, what's your ambition plan to set next? And what we need you to do is click on the relevant area or the relevant button and let us know your current plans. Let's get very excited by these things. We'll give it 10 more seconds. Then I'll ask Alex to magically pull up the results. Oh, there they go. So, not unsurprisingly, net zero coming top of the pack, followed closely by carbon neutral, which we've seen a lot of, and encouraging to see science-based targets high up there as well. Well, thank you for participating in that. The next question, just to keep us in the flow of this, is what is the action? Which of these climate actions does your company plan to achieve next? Not what you plan to do, but what is the action your company plans to achieve next? So we'll go through the same routine. Alex will flick up the questions. Be good to get your responses and see where the balance of views are. I'll give it 10 more seconds. Okay, thank you for that. And hopefully, again, Alex can magically present the results. Nope. And carbon neutral and SBTs are the two highest actions. Interesting. Well, we should reflect on that. It'll be interesting to hear the panelists' view on that when we get into the discussions. But thank you for participating in that. It was a good way just to get a sense of where people's mindsets are or where people's actions are in terms of their companies. Can I hand over to you, Alex, just to say a few words about the research, and then we'll hear from each of the panelists. So over to you, Alex.
Thanks very much, Vaughan. And I just want to start by saying it's not just my research. So I've been working very closely with a colleague, Mila, on this, and also some other colleagues across the across our organisation, and also it's our clients as well who've contributed to this, both this time around with some comments that we've published in there, but also in previous years we've had some fantastic feedback that's helped us evolve the research. So with that, those thank yous out of the way, just to introduce the research before I go through a few of the key findings. So this is our third year in a row, and we have looked at the climate action and commitments of the Fortune Global 500. So we did some of this through desk-based research, which is particularly around the carbon neutral and net zero commitments. And then we use some external databases, those of RE100 and science-based targets. The carbon neutral and net zero, of course, as we all know, you know, there are you know, different ways in which and different languages that different language that companies use for those. So we've at least at our first cut of data, which forms the most of our findings, we've kind of let companies self-define them. Then for one of the slides, you'll see when we've done a bit of digging in to some of the definitions being used. So over to our first finding, and really this one sums up what the number of companies that are committed to deliver a major climate milestone by 2030. So what we consider significant climate milestone are those four that you just saw there, and we've seen a big growth in those, up by 8 percentage points to 38% of the Fortune Global 500. So we set that out in this graph, which shows how that has really, those commitments have really got rolling since the Paris Agreement, which also, you know, incidentally was roughly around the time when science-based targets and RE100 started. But what you can also see on the right here is what has driven this growth in the last year is there was a 25% growth in the number of science-based targets being set, and then down the bottom here in the different shades of green, 50% growth in the number of carbon neutral, both 2030 goals, but also achievements that have been made. So that's our first finding there. And, you know, I guess as Vaughan said, you can see that as good or bad news. There's obviously fantastic momentum and growth, and it's now a really significant chunk of the Fortune Global 500 that has these near-term or medium-term milestones, but there's obviously 60+% that don't. Our next finding goes into a little bit more detail and looks at how those different commitments, but in particular the carbon neutral, science-based targets and net zero, are being used in combination by companies and over different time horizons. So we found that carbon neutrality leads the milestones that are achieved to date. Science-based targets lead the milestones between now and 2030, and net zero leads the milestones beyond 2030, with most, a vast majority of net zero targets set for further out than 2030. And so that really plays a little bit back into that the poll findings that we saw there, where we saw many net zero targets being set, and that won the first poll, which is what's the next target you're going to set. But in terms of the next one milestone to be achieved, carbon neutral and science-based targets came out stronger. So those are the kind of data points there, and then for those different kind of 3 timeframes, and then we plot them against all the landing of all of these 4 milestones as well, so that people can sort of see how that evolves over time. And so that's a different cut of the data to the previous slide, because this is when the commitments land, and you see, of course, a big spike around 2030 for science-based targets, when many companies have set their science-based target date, and similarly a big spike around 2050, which is when many companies have set their net zero targets. On to our next finding, which is around those net zero targets. So they have arrived big time, and they're a major pillar of action and the targets, but there is confusion over definitions, and so we think it's not kind of quite that simple. 25% of companies have a net zero target, and that is up 3x on last year. We consider 20% of these targets to be closer to carbon neutrality targets, 56% as responsible net zero targets, and 24% as leadership net zero targets. So what do we mean by responsible and leadership? We tried to set that out here. So in terms of those that we consider closer to carbon neutrality, there's an emerging consensus around net zero definitions as having a science-informed abatement target, having for those commitments to cover value chain emissions, and for removals to be used on the residual emissions. Now, whilst it's difficult to judge in terms of the science-informed targets, because some sectors can't set a science-based targets, for example, and it's also difficult to judge around the removals because companies communicate that in many different ways. We did find that 20% of these net zero targets didn't cover what we considered to be an acceptable covering of the value chain for it to be a net zero target. So those are the ones that we picked out there. Then we looked at the remaining ones. Responsible net zero targets we defined as those that have a target date in line with the government target where they're headquartered, or the Paris Agreement if there's no national target. And then leadership targets are the ones, companies that have set a target date that's ahead of the law of their land, essentially. So ahead of the relevant, the government target where they're headquartered, or if there isn't a target ahead of the Paris Agreement's goal for net zero. So those are our 3 findings. There's one more slide of mine, which just is some of the data which we use to make that responsible and leadership distinction between the net zero targets, because obviously we took into account the national government targets, and we also just pulled out across these 4 different actions, we pulled out the continent or region or continent splits of the data. So you can see Europe and North America, as you'd expect, well, given, for example, science-based targets, it's kind of launched and run from Europe. And so, yeah, that's our kind of regional and continental split of the data. So I will pause there. There's, more data that I can go into, but back to you, Vaughan. And look forward to hearing the reactions.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for sharing those results and some of those definitional issues, which I know have come up time and time again. Let's start, if we can, Elizabeth, with you. It'd be interesting to hear from your perspective at Microsoft. How do you see climate action evolving in the future? And particularly from what Alex has spoken about and hopefully shared with you in advance, be interested to hear your thoughts about what jumped out at you when you heard Alex speaking to some of the research.
Thank you, Vaughan. Thank you, Alex, and thanks for the invitation to be with you today. I'm, as mentioned before, lead the carbon program at Microsoft, but like all of you, I'm another human on the planet that's concerned about what's happening. We've seen the natural world and the political world in the past year plus telling us that we're out of balance. And as the farmer and the poet Wendell Berry says, whether we and our politicians know it or not, nature is party to all of our deals and decisions. And she has more votes, a longer memory, and a sterner sense of justice than we do. And I think that is coming home to roost now with the climate impacts we're seeing, the forest fires on the west coast of the United States, the flooding in Europe, and the climate strikes that that Greta Thunberg plans with youth climate activists this coming Friday. So as we head into COP26, we really see this convergence of attention on this climate crisis like never before. And I think that's really what came through in the research as well, what came through in this research. I would say that from Microsoft's perspective, we have a very aligned view of how to take climate action, how to learn from the trends, and specifically we think about it in terms of 3 M's. There's a lot of poetry and alliteration, I guess, over here in the west coast of the US, but we think about it in terms of meaning, measurement, and markets, and in terms of meaning, really clearly the atmosphere is going to tell us what the ledger, the atmospheric benefit or detriment is the ledger that we need to care about. And so from that perspective, we're really led by the science of reducing as much as possible, first and foremost, removing the rest. And that to us is the definition, is the strongest definition of net zero, removing only the hard to abate residual emissions. And I think climate activists around the world will definitely hold us accountable to that. In terms of measurement, our second M, we really think about how to, what the data tools and accounting principles are to actually count our progress toward carbon neutral, net zero, any of the targets that we set. And specifically, one exciting initiative that Microsoft has underway is a partnership with OS Climate, which is an open source data and analytics collaboration to help make climate risk and climate finance more transparent. And then lastly, with regard to markets, we've actually just yesterday announced a $100 million grant to the Breakthrough Energy Catalyst program to help accelerate the development of climate solutions that the world needs to reach net zero. Those include direct air capture, sustainable aviation fuel, green hydrogen, and long-term battery storage. And so at the risk of making this about Microsoft, I just want to share that those are some of the initiatives that we have underway, and I think they're illustrative of what we need to see in the world as a whole. And I think very much aligned with the research that Natural Capital Partners at ClimateCare have done.
Fantastic. And is there anything, Elizabeth, in the research that jumped out at you that you were surprised by, or?
Well, honestly, I'm surprised it's taken us all this long. I've been working on climate change for about 15 years now, and frankly, I think we need to move faster. Yeah. We don't have time to kind of fiddle around. And I think that we, in particular, I'm really concerned about the sort of muddiness in the definitions, as the research pointed out. This is not a surprise, but it was very positively reinforcing of things that we've been trying to do. The muddy distinction between carbon neutral and net zero is troublesome, and also even just the muddy definition of net zero is troublesome. And I think we really need to look to initiatives like the Science-Based Targets Initiative to help us really establish clear guidelines for accountability on that.
For sure. And do you think, Elizabeth, that sort of muddiness is sometimes used to sort of delay action? We often hear these debates about, oh, we're not quite clear on this, we're not quite sure where to go. Well, our urging is always to say, sure, we've got to get clear on this, but that doesn't stop you doing some stuff already. There's some low-hanging fruit that you can really get going on.
I don't think, maybe I'm just an optimist about human nature, overly optimistic. I don't think it's coming from a place of intentionally delaying action in most cases. I think it's coming from an array of well-meaning individuals, ourselves included, who maybe have their own spin on this common problem and don't quite have the commonality yet to understand how to measure progress. So to me, it's more about I think it very, very much has an effect of delaying meaningful action, but I don't necessarily think it's coming from a bad place.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Elizabeth. David, can I hand over to you from a HP perspective? I guess the same questions to you, which is, how do you see climate action evolving in the future from your perspective? And again, from what Alex has spoken about, what jumped out at you from some of the findings from the work Alex and his team have done?
Yeah, I'm happy to, and thank you again, Vaughan and Alex. I think Liz said it well at the start, and what I would just add is, on top of everything that people are experiencing around the world this summer and in recent years, the latest science and the report out of the IPCC is only reinforcing it, and it's calling for that need to act now, and that we cannot delay. I think it's that recognition in the business community is really what's helping to spur this along. And I'm optimistic in that regard that this is sending all the right signals throughout the world. So just briefly, net zero is part of HP's overall 2030 agenda for sustainable impact, which incorporates climate action, human rights, and digital equity. And that in turn is part of our company's now set 2030 vision, right there alongside culture, talent, portfolio, and financials, putting sustainable impact center stage. And this spring, we announced a series of specific climate action goals, which we believe are among the most aggressive and comprehensive in the technology industry. We took an approach that was holistic in both the view of the challenge and our contribution to address it. So not just focused on carbon emissions, but looking at increasing circularity to address the depletion of resources, to protect forests and address the loss of ecosystems, biodiversity. And specifically in carbon emissions, we've targeted to reduce our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions 50% by 2030 compared to 2019, and achieving net zero greenhouse gas across the value chain by 2040. And along the way, and as we've seen with a number of these other commitments and a number of other players, is that we've set to reach carbon neutrality in our operations by 2025, in our supplies business by 2030. So collectively, these goals really help to highlight the efforts and the work we're making, the progress to reach, to reduce our overall environmental footprint, strengthen our business for the long term, and deliver the most sustainable portfolio of products and solutions in the industry. Now, when I'm reflecting on that research and I think about putting us in this larger group too, yes, this definitely demonstrates that the climate action journey that the corporate world is on, the pace is accelerating. But like Liz, I ask, is it fast enough? On the one hand, you can say this is great. It's 38% of the Fortune 500. On the other hand, it's only 38%. But I think we can look at other signs alongside this that help to reinforce that. That the climate pledge is now 200 companies plus. We were pleased to just join that also this month. Business ambition for 1.5 has nearly 800 companies committed, 400 targets set. So there's overlap, but these are obviously bigger communities here as well. And these kinds of clear signals are being sent to a range of stakeholders for these companies, customers, investors, suppliers, employees, and policymakers. And these are signals that I think, as the report calls out, we can pursue both a purpose and a profit. And that's central to HP's vision for sustainable impact, to be the world's most just and sustainable technology company. It's the signal that these companies are driving industry change and innovation and making sure this is part of how they're going to be doing business. We're designing our plan to reach net zero around key business and sustainability strategies like product as a service and driving circularity. And as the report also calls, this is a signal for calling for policy action. And there's so many companies on this list. If you were to look against the investors and the companies that called to just the Biden administration this April to set a new NDC in line with net zero by 2050 and to have emissions by the end of the century, by the end of the decade, sorry. I think, second, the research also serves as an important and a valuable reference point, and it helps, frankly, I think it helps to make the business case for other companies to move forward. It did for us. We used this, but the previous iteration of this, we've used as benchmark, not just with our peers and competitors on the commitments they're making, but with our customers. We can see in this list quite a number of our largest accounts. We can associate sales dollars with that. We can understand and watch the rate of adoption of these commitments to net zero alone, doubling in a year. And we've been receiving requests from some of these same companies asking about our climate ambition, just as we are in turn asking our suppliers to raise that as well and meet 1.5 pathways. Vaughan, you mentioned that there's this gap between the ambition and action, and I do think there are signs too of a bit of that shift here from the what of the ambition to the how of the action. The research speaks about about how carbon neutrality is a step towards net zero. And I do think it's true. There's a number of ways that these commitments can reinforce each other. SBTs, to reach towards net zero using renewable energy and joining RE100 as an example to meet SBTs. That was our journey. We used our commitment to RE100 to drive our first science-based target. We've set higher ambition science-based targets then to set the pathway to net zero and to meet the science. And we, again at HP, we define and we use carbon neutrality as an interim step towards net zero, because we want it to be something that could signify and business segments or offerings to customers, but to keep it distinct from how we talk and think and act on net zero. And that all these types of commitments are also important to our leadership and for our company overall to show these interim steps and these milestones so that this isn't just something in the distant future.
Sure. And David, what do you think stops the other 60% taking more action then? So, as you say, the good news is more taking action and we're moving faster, but there's still a big rump that, still don't have meaningful targets. From your perspective, what would help them take action and move faster?
Well, I think it's seeing a lot of these other companies act, and I believe a couple things. One is that I think as Liz pointed out, we'll need to have more clarity around what net zero is and what it isn't. And that hopefully we'll see this will yield more of the responsible and leadership targets than ones that are a bit amorphous. And I think other companies are going to see that there is, with more and more of their customers, and that there'll be collaboration and pressure from both within sectors and across sectors in order to move beyond just individual company commitments and then work jointly towards what we really need to do to reach net zero. So in decarbonizing manufacturing, in transportation, the electricity grid in general, that these companies are now going to be bringing pressure points from a number of other places to partners and suppliers that will help to galvanize others to act as well.
Thank you, David. And I hope that's true. You do hope there is a sort of tipping point of pressure and tipping point of momentum that creates a sort of an inevitable domino effect, and could be early signs, I think, in the research Alex has done. David, thank you so much for that. So Zelda, over to you, and same set of questions really. What do you see as climate action? How do you see climate action evolving in the future? And again, what struck you about the findings that Alex shared earlier on?
Yeah, thanks, Vaughan. So back in, I don't know when it was, 2012, 2013, we had a government minister that said that insurers were canaries in the coal mine when it came to climate change. In other words, we had the risk data, we had the science, we could see the extreme weather impacts building up, and it's the same today. You know, there's increased frequency, there is increased intensity of weather events, and all of those things hit an insurer's bottom line. And Aviva, as an insurer, has been conscious of this for a long number of years. We started to be carbon neutral in our operations back in 2006 because we wanted to reduce our carbon as much as possible, and then avoid any additional carbon in respect of our residual emissions. And we've continued to be carbon neutral in our operations. In 2016, we signed up to RE100, and then we announced our net zero by 2040 as a company just in March this year, and signed up to science-based targets. So that's the kind of pathway that we've been taking on this journey. Just a couple of things from a financial services sector point of view. What corporate leaders are doing over the next few years. We have an insurance arm that underwrites the risks, but we also have an investment area. And for the last number of years, we've been calling on better disclosure from companies that we invest in, so that anyone in the financial services sector can take that information and it be decision useful. So we can understand where we should be lending money to, where we should be investing, and where we should be underwriting to support the whole economy move forward and transition to a low carbon economy. So we've been calling for that for a number of years. We've also more recently been calling for companies to sign up to science-based targets. So, like David, the supply chain's really important for us, both in terms of what we buy for ourselves as an insurance company, but also what we buy for our customers as part of our claims fulfillment process on the property and casualty side. But there is a piece that we also need to invest for the long term. We are investing people's pension money, and it's really important that the money that the companies that we invest in are sustainable for the long term, and we need to make sure that they are as low carbon as possible, that they are reducing their carbon emissions, and that they will be around in the next 40-50 years. So from our point of view, we see the next climate action as increased disclosure, so that people can understand both internally in the company and externally, like investors and insurers, where you actually are. And when we started doing the responses to the TCFD recommendations, we found that we were able to make better decisions internally because we were able to measure and manage our business better. So if we can do that and make that more sustainable, we can also help other companies and invest in other companies that are realizing where those climate risks are, where those impacts are, and help them to do better, to do business better from a climate point of view. So disclosure's a huge one for us. And the other piece that I think it was Elizabeth that mentioned it was collaboration. From a carbon neutral perspective, you don't really need to collaborate with any other companies. From an RE100, you don't really need to collaborate with other companies. But when it comes to science-based targets and you're looking at your supply chain for companies in the financial services sector, you are looking and taking responsibility for those companies that you are investing in or that you have shares in. Then you have to collaborate more. You have to talk to your suppliers. You have to talk to those companies that you invest in and get them to sign up to science-based targets, get them to understand their impacts and to set net zero targets, both the end goal of net zero, but also those milestone reduction targets that you need along the way, because you can't do that in isolation. You need that whole supply chain, both and we found from a financial services sector point of view, both across the sector. So we have things like the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance that looks at methodology and setting targets right across the asset owners. The Net Zero Insurance Alliance, which was just set up in July. And again, that conversation in terms of actually what does it mean to be a net zero insurer, and how we can collaborate so that we have meaningful definitions. We talked about the muddiness of carbon neutrality over net zero, and you really need to be able to be measuring that same set of data, whether you are an Aviva or an AXA or an Allianz, to be able to compare yourselves and make sure that we're all on the same journey and we're all going in the same direction. So I think collaboration is huge, both in the sector and also across sectors, because I might be in somebody else's supply chain, I might be investing in somebody else, and I can't get to net zero until everybody else does. Well, I can get as close as possible, but then the removals element of it is dependent on everybody else as well, getting in the same direction.
No, extremely good point, Zelda. And it triggers a question which one of the audience members have raised, which is also about how do you bring your consumer stakeholders with you as well. So the question here is, from a consumer goods participants, they would love to know how the sustainability comms plan of the panelist companies have evolved as their goals have progressed from RE100 to net zero to SBTIs, and how they ensure that the consumers or customers are brought along that journey. So you've talked about some of your supply chain where you have some leverage. I'd be interested to hear from you, Zelda, and then we'll go back to David and Elizabeth. How do you bring your consumers along with you on that journey as well? Zelda, let's start with you.
So one of the things that we have discovered is that we've been looking at pensions. It's what we do, and we've been looking at the types of funds that pensions are invested in. And when all these companies talk about net zero in terms of their business, it will be interesting to know how many of them have considered their pension bit as part of their business. How much influence do you have over your pension? Because all that money is being invested in other companies that could be high carbon emitters, they could be low carbon emitters. But it's really easy to understand where that money is going and how they can make some simple changes in order to help their employees on the journey, and also reduce their own carbon footprint because it's in their pension investments. So we did a piece of research earlier on in the year that looked at benchmarking funds and looked at sustainability investment funds, and also looked at different lifestyle options for consumers, whether it's switching from a meat-based diet to a vegetarian diet, whether it's switching from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. And we found that it was 21 times more effective to switch a pension to a sustainable fund than it was to do every other thing else, all these other different lifestyle changes. Not saying that lifestyle changes you shouldn't do, absolutely you should do them. But if you move where your money is going to, you can influence those companies and reduce your carbon footprint at the same time. So that's our consumer piece, is that be aware of where your money is being invested and make decisions based on your values, on your company's values, to make sure that you're not diametrically opposed to the rest of your business.
Very good. Yeah, and it encourages people to realize they do have power and actions they can take as well. David, same question to you then. You know, what have you done at HP to bring the consumer or your customers along with you on your journey?
Well, yeah. So when we look at that, of course, we look at our customers. We serve everyone from an individual consumer to the largest enterprises and governments in the world. And I think it's with, and we also have a very limited direct touch, that is, but the majority of the considerable majority of our sales are actually through the channel, whether that's retail channel or commercial channel. So the role of partners in that regard is also very important, and how we can be continuing to go to market and to reach customers and continue to serve customers in ways that is also going to help reinforce our work with our partners, and help drive their sustainability stories and ambitions along. We have a number of great partners who are very advanced, but we've also got, we got thousands who are just like suppliers. They're at whole different ends of their of that continuum and their own evolution. So we've started a program called Amplify Impact, where we can help bring more and more of our own partners along in developing their own sustainability initiatives, and to be able to communicate those to market along with our message. When it comes ultimately to the end user, I agree with Zelda. It has a lot to do whether, again, you're talking about the commercial enterprises and governments, and again, we're getting very clear signals from a great many of those about what are they expecting and what do they want to see from us. And it is harder with the individual consumer because there's a lot to cut through. I mean, just the range of these commitments and what does this mean versus what does that mean is going to be a continued challenge, I think, to reach the end consumer. But it is really about connecting the customer's values to the value that your solution is delivering to them, and being able to demonstrate that in both they know what they have and how that was made, or how it's going to perform, and help them to reach their own goals or aspirations.
Thank you, David. Same question, Elizabeth.
Yeah, that's I'm finding both of these responses from Zelda and David really useful and meaningful. I think that for us, it's thinking about broadly what's in scope of our target, everything that we can meaningfully have influence on. So it's both the supply chain and customer value chain. And so for us, it's been really helpful and meaningful to have a carbon fee that we've expanded as part of our carbon negative commitment. We've expanded that to cover our supply chain. We've also expanded that to cover our product use. So all of the electricity that gets consumed by Surface devices, by Xboxes in the gaming, the gaming work that we do, we're now covering with that internal carbon fee. And so we're looking to decarbonize that. I would also say it's exceedingly important for us and other companies who want to take action along these lines to help drive transparency across the value chain in carbon emissions. So certainly our carbon fee has helped to do that internally, but we're also really doubling down on getting smarter about about our supply chain emissions and our customer related emissions, the emissions related to the life cycle of our product design. What we know in the trade is scope 3, and that is a bird's nest and sometimes a Gordian knot, but it's a really, really important one to untie, because we need to be able to, I think as Zelda said, we need to be able to count emissions consistently across sectors. And then lastly, I would say I was really excited to hear about Aviva's work on decarbonizing their investments. On a related note, it was great to see Harvard University decide to divest from fossil fuels in their investments, and that's certainly Harvard, although in a different sector entirely, I think that's a real beacon of action to come. So to me, it's exciting to see this level of sort of responsibility and accountability show up.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And it's interesting. I mean, on how many university pension funds are taking a lead in some of this. They are really pushing the boundaries. Now, there's a question here. It's directed to yourselves, Elizabeth and David, but I don't see why Zelda couldn't cover this one as well, which is really, how are you creating a holistic approach which considers carbon alongside waters, minerals, extractions, recycling of used products, etc.? So carbon, yes, but should we be thinking broader and more holistically? I'll start with you, David, if I can, and then go back to Elizabeth, and then Zelda, if you've got some thoughts, by all means, chipping in. But David.
Yeah, sure. So absolutely, as I think I mentioned at the outset, for us, we really need to take a holistic view. And with our climate action strategy is actually underpinned looking at carbon emissions, as I've spoken to, circularity, as well as forests in particular, but I think more nature writ large. But as a printing company, thinking and focusing on the impacts to forests is central to the business models, is central to the way people perceive, and it's going to be central to serving as a climate solution as well. So for circularity, we are looking to increase that reuse of materials, of product, more renewable materials, to the tune of, by the end of this decade, we have a goal for 75% product and packaging circularity. That's essentially looking at the total weight of all material going into our products and packaging as a denominator, and as a numerator, what share of that is renewable, is recycled, or is reused materials or product. We aspire to go far beyond that. But those are, there are challenges in that. There's a lot to drive there in market transformation, supply transformation, reverse logistics, and the like to serve it. But I'll point out that there's an important relationship that we see with circularity and how that can serve our climate goals as well. So we've looked at the complementary nature as well as where we need to watch for the tensions and that the trade-offs can exist. And then in terms of forests, we do account for our for the emissions associated with the consumption of paper during the product life cycle and printing. We report that out, but only a small portion of that is HP brand paper, where we've already eliminated deforestation through responsible sourcing, certified and recycled sources for our paper and our paper-based packaging. We're going beyond that now to focus on all the paper that is used through HP printers, and to counterbalance deforestation associated with that by the end of the decade through forest protection, restoration, and responsibly managed forests as well. Because of that role, as I mentioned, in terms of being both a means of carbon sequestration and also important to biodiversity and ecosystems, and for indigenous and local communities as well.
Interesting, David. Thank you. Elizabeth, same question. Holistic approach.
Yeah, crucial question. And in 2020, Microsoft set a series of commitments reflecting this multifaceted nature that needs to go beyond carbon. We set a carbon negative commitment, which was, as I mentioned before, to reduce over half of our emissions, remove the rest. I think it's also important to talk about how we define removal. Can come back to that if you like. But then also a zero waste commitment, a water positive commitment, and then an ecosystems commitment that under which we commit to restore or protect more land than we use by the year 2025, and actually also to create what we call a planetary computer, which is a suite of data tools and a platform to enable environmental professionals around the world to accelerate their work through the use of high speed and big computing. So it's crucially important, and I think that it's not only important as sort of individual programs and commitments, but also I think important to think about those, as David was alluding to, the complementarity of those issues within programs. So for example, in our carbon program, and in particular in our carbon removal program, we think about, and we have criteria for, as anyone who's applied to our request for proposals knows, we have a very long set of criteria. Vaughan's laughing because I think he knows that intimately, that we have a very long set of criteria around water, environmental justice, other issues of sustainability, and we take that really seriously. And we know that it's, you know, if we only optimize for carbon, we might inadvertently create problems down the line.
Yeah, no, I think quite right. I mean, so often we are brought up to think it's either or rather than both and. You know, we want both these things together, not either or, for sure. Zelda, opportunity from Aviva's perspective in terms of holistic view, and then I have a specific question for you as well after this about sustainable funds.
So the World Economic Forum produces a risk report every year, and they have this really cool interactive web of how different risks are impact different areas, and climate change is generally right in the middle there because it is such an interconnected issue, whether it's about health or biodiversity or justice or human rights. You know, it's there in the middle of this interconnected web, and so carbon can't be just taken in isolation. And that's why we've done things like on the biodiversity side, it's still a work in progress because, you know, the biodiversity data is 6 to 10 years behind carbon. So we need to really understand what we're talking about when we talk about biodiversity impact. But it can go from anything like we have put solar carports on our car parks of our offices. That must be so much better than putting it on agricultural land, because it's a car park already. So, you know, why not use it properly to its full extent? So you're reducing your biodiversity impact that way. Through to things like when we have an insurance product that for fossil fuel companies that have aging wells or pipelines, we have a product that means that the company has to put the environment back in the position it was in before. It's called a surety bond, and that's really useful. And you bring into that things like indigenous-led restoration, and you're ticking a lot of boxes. Not saying that those products should be done for new exploration or investment, but those existing ones. So how can we put, you know, the land back into the position it was in before? I suppose uniquely from an insurance company point of view, we look at resilience to climate change as well. Really, really important. And when we do have an extreme weather event and we're building back, we build back more resiliently. So whether it's in Canada, we use hail-resistant tiles, so that the next hail event that comes along, it doesn't cause the same amount of damage again, or hurricane clips, or single one-way valve sewer systems, so you don't continue to just, you know, go through the process again and again when you have these weather events. And then linked to that, zero waste claims is something that we're looking at the moment. So For the UK, we have a zero waste to landfill from our offices. That's been in place since 2015. But now we're extending that to our claims supply process, so that when we do remove carpets that are flooded and damaged and can't be dried, or when we have to take plaster off the walls, what do we do with that? How can we turn that, and as David says, close that that loop to make it a circular process? So there's lots of different things that we can do. We're a health insurer as well as a property and casualty insurer. So air pollution and extreme weather is really important, that we understand it and know how to help our customers deal with those kind of things, because that has an impact on health and longevity. So yeah.
A lot to consider. And I just looked at the time, and as we're coming to the top of the hour, there was an interesting question for you, Zelda, which we can take offline, which is, how does Aviva define a sustainable fund? Which my sense is either a very short or a very long answer. So maybe a conversation.
The very short one is, it's difficult. We're getting there. We know what's more sustainable and what's less sustainable. But haven't yet developed a net zero fund. But we're getting there.
Well, I'm sure you can be the first, and I'm sure we can help you on that as well. We are getting close to the end of the hour, so I mean there were many more questions, and as in all these things, we could go on for a long time. Before we finish, I mean, first of all, I'd like to say thank you to our panelists, to Elizabeth, David, and Zelda, and to Alex as well, for your participation and sharing your insights and wisdom about what you've done. Hearing you speak is always very inspiring, because we're talking to leaders in the sector who are pushing the boundaries of what we could and should be doing. But one of the things we wanted to do towards the end is to do a sort of optimism feeling, because of course we come away from this feeling very inspired, but of course we can't forget the fact that that Alex mentioned, which is 60% have still not got meaningful targets. So there's cause for optimism in hearing what we're doing, and there's cause for concern that actually, are we doing enough? So to try and sort of round this off, we wanted to finish off with a sort of where do we sit on our sort of optimism barometer? So how does this research leave you feeling? So in the final question we'd like you to put in is, how does this research leave you feeling? We give you 10 seconds to click in your answers. Fantastic, thank you for that, and I'll let Alex do his magic. That was very good, very good. That is certainly balanced, outraged and optimistic, which I think is probably what we need to be. Optimistic that we can do more, but outraged that we need to do it quicker, and there's still more to be done, for sure. Again, final huge thanks. I'm sure if everybody was off mute, we'd all do a round of applause. People will find some virtual button where you can do virtual clapping, which is beyond me, I have to say. But a huge thank you again to Alex, Elizabeth, David, and Zelda, and thank you everybody who's joined the session to participate and share some of their questions. It has been recorded. We will try to make sure that there is an outreach to everybody who's been involved in joining this webinar, so that we can share some of that. And Alex will, of course, remind us where people can get access to the research. Alex, I shall hand over to you for your promo link.
Yeah, so there's the link, but we will send it round, and that will give people access to both a snapshot on our webpage where we've put those 3 graphs that I've run through, but also the full 20-odd page report, which goes into more detail. So I encourage people to check that out.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you all very much, and look forward to speaking to you in due course. Many thanks. Bye then.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.